Some point last year I picked up a very sorry and mouldy Amiga 500. You may have seen the video I did on the history of the A500 where I repaired and cleaned it up. Previously on Retrobytes. Oh god, it smells so bad. Wow, now it still smells of wrong and the bleach. I guess I'm just gonna have to keep washing it. Well, guess it's time to recap this thing. It no longer smells and it works. I think I just did a recap of me recapping there. That's a first. Despite the fact that this machine no longer smells and runs more or less fine, it is still a stock A500, which is fine, but I can only really run games by booting a floppy disk. And it turns out I'm just not as patient as I used to be. So that means 1 year on, it's time to Amiga 500. Yep, it's time to pimp this thing. I'm going to start with the CPU and RAM. I want enough to make this thing a bit faster and enough RAM to run WHD load. After all, it is the floppy disk loading part I'm trying to get rid of here. So I need an accelerator that's powerful enough but not too expensive, so I'm not going to be shoving a vampire in here and anything. Instead, I'm going to have a little look at one of the Terrible Fire accelerators. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Terrible Fire, it's a range of cards made by a chap called Stephen Leary, who's got his own YouTube channel called Terrible Fire, you'll be unsurprised to discover. And there, he talks quite amiably and does design work on this thing, so you actually get to watch him creating the cards. Now, I must admit, I've watched quite a few of these, and I found them really entertaining and also, informative as well. And I know way more about crossing clock domains than I ever did before. So I feel like I know these cards better than I know any other card that's ever been made for the Amiga. So when one came up on a decent price on eBay, yeah, you're gonna bet I bought that thing. Now, it's not the fastest card in the world. It's just a 68030, but it is running at 50 megahertz, which is, not bad at all. And it's got 64 meg of RAM, which is, way more than I'm gonna need for HD load. After all the work spent cleaning and sorting out this A500, the case still doesn't look that good. Yeah, sure, it's not covered in mould anymore and smells just fine, but it's not looking that great. It's kind of got interesting splotches of yellow on it. It's got like a marbly thing going on. Now, admittedly, looking at the footage of this as I record the voiceover, yeah, it's not showing up particularly well on the camera, it must be said, but trust me, this thing does not look great. And if it was just a bit yellow, yeah, that'd be fine, but it's kind of patches and that somehow bugs me more than it just being yellow, so it's time to do something about it. I know some of you at home will be thinking, yay, retrowriting time! No, it's not retrowrite time. I know some people really like the whole retrowriting idea, but to be honest, it's just not me. I suppose what I'm worried about is the chemical change that takes place in the plastic. Yes, it does make it go back to its original colour, most of the time, although sometimes it just gets marbly and weird, which is what this looks like now, although fairly subtly compared to what happens at the end of the retrowriting. No, what I'm worried about more is that it'll make the plastic brittle. So I'm going to do something completely different. I'm going to paint this thing. Before painting this thing, I've got to prep it. Now, it's already pretty clean, but I give it a quick once over anyway, to get it to how it is as you see before you now. And I'll need to use some tape to mask off the bits I don't want to get spray painted. So there's a number of silver stickers on here that I want to preserve. So I'll put some tape over them, as you can see me doing now. And I use a knife to trim the excess. This should hopefully keep a good job of keeping the paint off them. Next is to set up an area outside that I can do some spraying in and get the cases placed out there. Spray paint fumes are not something I particularly want to be breathing in, so outside is good if you've got somewhere to, paint outside. If not, you're going to need yourself a breathing mask for this job. Once everything's set up, it's time to heat up the paint. Now, this is a trick someone who does a load of spray painting told me about. You essentially put your spray tin in a bowl of warm water. That gets the paint up to a decent working temperature. Now I can take my freshly warmed can outside of undercoat and start spraying the Amiga parts. Now I'm using the plastic undercoat here that's pretty good at binding to plastic. It makes a nice layer for the proper paint I'm going to put on later. Now I chose grey spray paint well, it's pretty easy then to see which parts I've not managed to spray paint. So I'll give it a first coat, which takes a little while. And then end up leaving it for about 10 minutes or so, because that's what the tin says it takes to go touch dry. And yeah, that's looking fairly good. Reasonably happy with that. I've missed a few little bits around the edges, so we give it a little bit of a touch up. Get the first covering all fairly even. And then after that's gone touch dry, Well, then it's time to do the second coat and spray everywhere again, so I get a good build-up of paint on this thing. Once the second coat's all done, again I'll leave it again for another 10-15 minutes just to get itself set reasonably well. Now everything's all nicely undercoated, it's time to pick the colour for this thing. Now if you're a regular viewer of this channel, and I'm told there's at least 2 by the YouTube dashboard, you'll know I've got a bit of a thing for SGI machines. I really like SGI kit, what can I say? So, when I spotted a spray paint on the website that was basically the same colour as the Indigo 2 and the Indy, yeah, you know that was the spray paint I was going to buy, right? So yes, my Amiga 500 is going to get a bit of an SGI look to it. So I have to heat up this colour paint again, yeah, a little bit of hot water, get the paint so it flows nicely, and I have to give it a damn good shake as well. It says for 1.5 minutes, so yeah, I was shaking this thing for a while. Then finally we actually start to get spraying some Amiga parts. As you can see me doing the top sides of the cover. I'll kind of whiz through all these bits together and yeah, we'll do a spraying montage. There we go. Montages are a great way to get things done. If I need one good montage in real life. As you can see, the paint goes on quite nicely and it's starting to look pretty good. Now once the colour layer's all dry and I've checked to see when it goes together that there are no weird little bits of paint or any of the undercoat showing through and that it's all nice and even, it's time to do the top coat. Now the top coat I'm going for doesn't actually add anything to the look of the machine. This one's a matte clear spray coat and it's there really just to protect the paint layer underneath from like small scratches and stuff like that. Now I left the colour coat for quite a while to dry before putting this one on because you want to make sure that the paint underneath is really dry before applying the top coat. So I left this for a few hours. Now one thing about this top coat is it really does smell just awful compared to the other ones. I mean, it's not like the other paint smelled great, don't get me wrong, but this one's, yeah, it's got a smell to it. And I also made the mistake of leaving the door to the house a little bit open, so yeah, the kitchen did not smell too awesome after this for a while, so I had to leave the windows open for a while to clear that smell. But it goes on fairly well, and you can see it just sort of changes the colour a little bit while it's wet so you can see where you've painted before. And after quite a little bit of spraying, we got ourselves a nicely top coated bit of plastic. Now the top coat you have to leave to dry for a long time. It takes half an hour to get touch dry, but you have to leave it for 24 hours before you can put a second coat on, which is a long time to wait. So we won't make you wait for that part, we'll just magically fast forward, and here me is the next day, doing a little bit of top coating. Now that's all nicely done, I'll leave that for yet another 24 hours to get it all nice and hardened off. Yeah, if anyone thought spray painting a case is quick, it's really not. Not only do you spend a fair amount of time prepping and actually spraying, there's a lot of waiting for things to dry. Now admittedly I've not recorded most of the bits where the paint's drying, as otherwise this would be a video literally of paint drying, which I'm told is not very interesting, and certainly wouldn't do wonders for the whole YouTube algorithm thing. Speaking of which, I'll just take a moment out of this video to say thank you to everyone who's subscribed to the channel. We recently hit 4,000 subs, which is a pretty significant milestone in a channel of this age. So I'd just like to thank all of you for watching, and those of you who've chosen to subscribe. I'll even put in a cheeky plug for why not subscribe, because it really does help out small channels like this one, so people actually get to see the videos. Right, let's get back to the hardware. Now one of the things about the terrible fire accelerator I've purchased is that it's got a hard drive on it, which, is great. Unfortunately it doesn't boot with the 1.3 Kickstart ROM because it just doesn't know how to find that hard disk controller. So I'm going to have to upgrade my ROM. Now I could have just put Kickstart 2 in here, or 3.1, but the show wasn't called Mildly Improve My Ride, it was called Pimp My Ride, so we're going to stick in the very latest Kickstart 3.2 ROM. Ooh, really pushing the boat out on this one. Admittedly, the Kickstart ROM is not easy to get out. I mean, it's been in there for over 20 years, so it did not want to shift easily, but eventually it popped out, and I was able to stick in the 3.2 ROM. Yeah, just making sure that the notch is pointing to the same way that it is on the PCB. There we go, put the thing in fairly easily. Yeah, just make sure I don't bend any of the pins, and there you go, the ROM's installed. Now I got a few other little bits of hardware to go in here. The first one being the Amiga RGB to HDMI board. Now, I do intend to make use of this at some point, but the Raspberry Pi that needs plugging into it hasn't arrived yet. So I'm, to be honest, just fitting it so I don't lose it. Because, it'll probably hang out somewhere with my key puller. So, having popped out the Denise chip, I'm able to stick the RGB in place. and then we stick the Denise chip into that, and the whole thing just sits back on the board. Now the final thing to go in here is a handy little device so I can swap over which floppy drive is drive 0. Because I've got a Gotek mounted in an external floppy drive case, I want to be able to simply plug this thing into it and, boot games from it. Now, although an updated OS will let me choose to boot from an external floppy drive, that floppy drive is still DF1, not DF0, which means that a bunch of games that are hard-coded for DF0 really aren't going to work. So this little board lets me swap over which one's DF0, which one's DF1. So I set the switch so DF0 is the external drive and DF1's the internal, because I'm much more likely to boot games off the external rather than internal drive at the moment. Now I don't particularly want to make a hole in my case for this switch, so I route it round so it's just under the trapdoor so I can get at it that way without opening up the whole case. While we wait for all this paint to dry, it's time to get an operating system installed on this thing. Now, as mentioned earlier, I've got a new Kickstart 3.2 ROM for this thing, so we're going to install OS 3.2. Now, the CF card the accelerator came with Workbench 3.1 installed on it, which is fine, but we want to upgrade this thing. So I take the compact flash card and stick it in my laptop. I configure UAE to match the spec of the machine and stick the 3.2 ROM image off the CD in there. Then we let our Amiga boot up. Now it's quite handy being able to use UAE for this, because currently the Amiga's in bits, and also I didn't want to have to try and fix up a CD drive to this thing. I mean, I've got one, but it needs some restoration work. So, once it's booted, and we got the ISO in there, we're able to open it up. First of all, we run this program that maps the installer image. It takes a few moments. And then we can choose the English installer. And it brings up your standard Amiga installer, and we're able to click through the various options. And before too long, this thing's copying files to our hard drive. It takes a fair few minutes for this to happen, but once it's done, we're able to reboot the machine. Now we do the second part of the install. Here we need to copy over the CPU libraries. This will support our 68030 processor we've got installed. Now finally, once that's done, that card's ready to stick back in our Amiga 500 when we're ready to put it all together. So while the case is coming along nicely, it's time to do something about the keyboard. Yeah, so the keyboard has its yellowing issues too. In fact, no two keys are actually the same colour. In fact, sometimes even one key is not the same colour. So yeah, we're really going to have to do something about this. So I need to pick a colour that goes quite well with the SGI colour I've chosen for the casing, and also something, well, where I can get labels to go on the keys so that they still have letters on them come the end of the process. So I'm going to go with black, because I can get labels in black, and black goes quite well with the SGI colour too. But first I've got to actually get the keys off the keyboard. Now, I own a key puller tool somewhere. Can I find it? No, of course I can't. I need to use it. Why would I be able to find it? So after having searched around my house for a while, got a bit annoyed. Had a cup of tea, went back to search my house, I still didn't find it. So eventually I just gave up and decided I would just use my IC extraction tool instead. But I managed to do it without destroying any of the keys, so that was pretty good. Once they're finally all extracted and I've brushed all the crap off the bottom of them, it's time to think about painting them. So I take them all outside after having given them a bit of a clean up, set them all out on the paper ready to be spray painted. Again, it's time to use the base coat first. I'm using exactly the same grey stuff that I used on the casing. Now spray painting these is a little bit more tricky because the force propellant from the can is also the force enough to move the keys. So occasionally you'll be spray painting and then one key will just sort of fly off from the power of the spray, which is really annoying. But I managed to get them all eventually coated. And I'll leave them to dry for 10-15 minutes, and I'll spot the little bits I didn't manage to do the first time, so they get a little bit more of a spray paint, until eventually they are all genuinely coated properly. After they've dried fully, it's time to get some black paint, get in the hot water to get it all warmed up, and to spray these keys. Again, you have the problem with the spray, can move the keys while you're spraying them. So you need to be careful, basically. If two keys get stuck together, then you need to unstick them, clean them, spray them again. But after a nice bit of a spray, the keys are all done and they dry and they're looking pretty good. That's when I need to get them back on the keyboard and get them labelled. Now first of all, there's the whole getting them on the keyboard part. That takes a while. Now luckily you can still just about make out what the letter was underneath, so you can make sure that all the keys end up in the right place so the whole keyboard fits properly. Then I got these black stickers that I ordered in the post that turned up. Now they all fit the smaller Amiga keys just fine. So the letter keys, the number keys, that sort of thing. But the larger keys, no, they didn't make the stickers the same size as the top of the key, which is really frustrating. So if you look at the F keys, you can really make out the edge of the sticker. Really bugs me. I mean, they are only making these things to go on an Amiga, so why they couldn't just make them all exactly the right size for the key, I got no idea. Still, the overall looks pretty good and they feel quite nice under the fingers, so we got ourselves a pretty decent keyboard. Right, so as I put all this thing together, I notice I've got a little bit of a problem. The accelerator's making the keyboard sit up just a little bit too much. I'm going to have to get a CPU relocator so I can shift where the accelerator card is so that the keyboard sits down properly. Luckily I have one, so I'm able to pop that on, stick the card in. The keyboard still doesn't fit entirely flat. It turns out the IDE ribbon's just holding it up just a little bit too much. So I removed the retaining clip off the back of the IDE connector, put a little bit of electrical tape there so nothing shorts, and now finally our keyboard sits flat. This means I'll be able to screw the whole machine back together again in a minute. So finally the moment of truth, we get to boot this thing up. And it boots. It takes a while to boot. Yeah, it's not fast. Still booting. Really does take a... I'm going to fast forwards. Having fast forwarded, we've now booted. Hurrah! However, there's one less good part of this. If you have a look at the amount of chip memory this thing's got, we've only got half a meg. Now, that's because there's only half a meg on board. Now, you might be thinking that's what that trapdoor extension's for. Not quite, sadly. Yeah, that half meg extension that's in the trapdoor, yeah, that's what we call slow RAM, the worst kind of memory in the Amiga. Yeah, basically in the Amiga there's two kinds of memory pretty much. You have chip RAM, which is accessible by the CPU, and all the custom chips that do the graphics and sounds, etc. Half the time that memory can't be accessed by the CPU because the custom chips are using it. The other kind of memory you have is fast memory, which is only accessible by the CPU but can be accessed by the CPU all the time. The custom chips can't get at it. Now, slow memory is actually the worst of both of those worlds. It's all routed through Agnes, so the CPU can only get it half the time, but it's also not chip mem, so the custom chips can't use it either. So what you've just got is, well, essentially something that this thing thinks of as fast RAM, but can only use 50% of the time, which is kind of rubbish. But there's some good news here. We can ever so slightly modify the A500's motherboard, so that half meg of slow RAM, yeah, becomes chip RAM. Then we got a meg of chip RAM, and then things like this won't happen. Yeah, that's Frontier failing to load because there's not enough chip RAM to start it. I mean, if I boot the thing into sort of emergency boot mode where we don't use as much chip RAM, you can see we actually managed to start Frontier. Yeah, so it's entirely a chip memory based problem. So, time to bust out the soldering iron. Right, there's two jumpers need modifying for this thing to work. First we have jumper 2. Now there's a track that runs below, well, runs from the middle of the jumper set to the lowest pad on the jumper set. That track we're going to have to cut, so I use a small knife and cut that track. And then use my multimeter just to check that it's definitely cut through properly. Yeah, no, that's worked. And then, having moved the machine where I can do a little bit of soldering, we're then going to solder the middle pad to the top pad. Essentially the opposite of what it was before. There we go, so we do that. Build up a little bead of solder on each pad, and then a bit of a bead to join them together. There we go, that's worked fairly well. I'll now check continuity just to make sure that it isn't linked to the bottom pad. Yep, that's good. And then finally we have one more to do where we need to cut one more track. This is on the jumper right next to the trapdoor itself. And again, we need to cut one link in there. Just check that there's a good, no connectivity between those. Okay, a few mega ohms. Yeah, that's just leaking through another chip there. So that's successfully sliced. And then we power our Amiga back up again. And the good news, yep, we got one whole megabyte of chip memory now. Excellent. And Frontier will start. Hurrah! Now while we're running Frontier, this gives us a chance to check out the performance of the machine. Now my original 500, Frontier used to run, well, kind of like a flickbook. It was kind of like 10 or 12 frames a second during the intro. Here we can see it's nipping along very nicely. That 030 really doing its job quite well. In fact, let's have a look at this thing in sysinfo. Yeah, we can start to see how well this thing performs. Now let's do its straight CPU speed test. As we can see, we're faster than the Amiga 3000, less powerful than an 040 Amiga. Yeah, that's not surprising. I mean, we are running an 030. But yeah, twice as fast as an A3000 is pretty good. I mean, that's probably because this thing runs at 50 MHz, whereas the A3000 ran at about 25 MHz. Now, the other thing we can show off is the performance of its memory. Yeah, this card doesn't use regular DRAMs like a lot of other cards would use. Here we use static RAM. Now there's two advantages to this. First of all, the whole static RAM thing means we didn't need a circuit there to keep refreshing the DRAMs so they don't just lose all their data, which is what DRAMs do if you don't refresh them. This is one of the reasons why DRAMs are cheaper than SRAM. The second advantage, which is the way more important one in terms of the user, is that SRAM, well, it's faster. It's faster memory access times than DRAMs. So this means our CPU never has to wait around for stuff from memory. So instead of just a synthetic CPU benchmark, let's try it against something that actually does something in and out of memory and does some calculations on it. Right, here we go. And as you can see, we come out really well on this one. Yeah, in real world uses, that SRAM, yeah, it does make a bit of a difference to how quickly this machine can do stuff. Of course, speed is not why we bought this accelerator, but you know, it's nice to see it performing well. Now we've painted up our case and got all our keyboard looking nice, well, we're going to need a mouse to go with it. Yep, it's time to tank mouse. Yep, as luck would have it, I happen to have a tank mouse that's in need of a little bit of TLC. This one doesn't actually work. I've got no idea what's wrong with it. It's nothing obvious, that's for certain. So we have a mouse ready to be fixed up. The first thing we need to do is take it apart. Once all our parts are prepped, we get them in a box ready to be undercoated. Again, I have to warm through the tin of undercoat, give it a good shake, and then we can spray all the mouse parts and get them all undercoated. There we go, they don't look too bad. Leave them once again to dry for 10 minutes or so, and then check them over to see if any bits have got missed. Give a little second coat if needed. There we go, a few areas need touching up. And again, leave them to dry for a while. Then it's time for the coloured layer. So, we got our tin of spray paint that matches the Amiga case, and we give that a good old spray. Ooh, look, we got some SGI looking mouse parts now, very cool. And then we take the plastic for the buttons and we give them a black coat, so they contrast a little bit with the body of the mouse. Again, not looking too bad, that seems to have come out alright. And again, we leave it all there for 10 minutes to dry. Once that colour coat's looking pretty good and all dried out, and then get a tin of the top coat and give it a bit of a spray. This should give it a nice decent finish and a sort of durable quality. Yeah, that's not looking too bad, and we leave that to rest for quite a while. This one needs about half an hour to get touch dry. And once it's all dried, I eventually get to assemble my mouse. This is where it's going to get a bit of an upgrade. Like all mouses at this point in time, the tank mouse is a ball mouse, and you know, we've moved on a little bit since then. We've got optical mice. And as the ball bit of this mouse just doesn't work, yeah, I'm going to take that PCB out. I'm not going to bin it. I'm going to keep it as a spare, but we've got a nice new optical mouse board to go inside it. Now, it comes with a set of fitting instructions, which I attempt to follow, and we look at this diagram, and yeah, that was photocopied pretty badly. This diagram is of relatively little help, but you know, it's getting me to fit the lens bit somewhere. I mean, it's on the PCB, I can't tell which side of it, but I think we can figure this out for ourselves. And a moment or two later, we've got ourselves a fully assembled tank mouse. Now, that's why I'm putting this tank mouse together. I noticed there's a little bit of a problem with the paint. If you look at this corner, assuming I can persuade the camera to focus on it, you can see this bit's all gone a bit wrinkly. I suspect actually there was a little bit too much colour paint there and it's dried and yeah, made the top coat go wrinkly. Yeah, that's not good. I think we're going to have to do this again. Now, this is one of the great advantages with spray painting as opposed to retrobrighting. If it all goes wrong, yeah, I can do it again. So here's our mouse again, and this time I've taken all the paint off it and we're down basically to the base layer again. There's a few little bits of undercoat here and there, just a tiny odd little bit. There's no point in cleaning this completely because I'm just going to spray it with undercoat again. So once again, it gets undercoated, we leave it for a little while, it gets a coloured coat, leave it for a little while. Then finally it gets a top coat, leave it for a long while. And here we go, here's our now finished and improved tank mouse. There we go, we assemble this all together for the last time, and we've got ourselves a good looking optical tank mouse. Well, that about brings us to the end of this thing. We've managed to really improve this Amiga. It's got a decent accelerator in it, decent amount of memory, we've even got more chip RAM, new OS, and we can even use an external floppy drive as the boot drive now. And it looks good. I mean, it looks way better than I thought it was going to look. The paint job's actually come out pretty well. Well, if you made it this far, all it remains for me to say is thank you very much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, why not like and share it with people that you know. And of course, if you're feeling in the mood to really help the channel out, a nice little subscribe really makes a huge difference to small channels like this one. You could even consider gently clicking the little bell thing. I'm not going to say smash it.